A chilling, emotional journey through betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate revenge. What happens when the person you trust most becomes the one who betrays you the deepest? I used to think I knew her. After 7 years together, I believed I understood Claire completely. Her moods, her little habits, the way she'd smile when something delighted her, the way she'd frown when something troubled her. I thought we shared a connection that no one could break. I thought I knew the person I was married to. But I was wrong. It all started with something so insignificant, or so it seemed at first. One afternoon, as I walked into the kitchen to grab a drink, I saw her phone sitting on the counter. It wasn't like her to leave it unattended. Normally, Claire was careful about her privacy, always keeping her phone closed even when she went to the bathroom. She wasn't the type to let her guard down. But for some reason that day, it sat there, vulnerable, just inches away from me. I didn't plan to check it. I wasn't the type to invade her privacy. But as I poured myself a glass of water, something compelled me to glance at the screen. Maybe it was a strange gut feeling. Maybe it was just the way things had been between us recently, distant, strained, as if something had shifted without either of us acknowledging it. The message on the screen was brief, but it hit me like a punch to the stomach. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I've missed you more than you know." It was from Ryan, my best friend, the guy I had known for years, the guy I trusted with everything. My first thought was disbelief. This had to be a mistake, right? Maybe it was some kind of joke, but deep down I knew it was. I didn't need to read any more to understand what was happening. They'd been having an affair, Claire and Ryan, behind my back, and not just a one-time slip-up. The history of their relationship was clear in the context of the message. The casual tone, the intimacy, she missed him. I didn't react immediately. I didn't scream or confront her. Instead, I stood there, frozen. The water from the glass I was holding spilled over the rim and dripped down my fingers. It was almost poetic, the perfect symbol of how everything was slipping through my fingers. I didn't confront Claire right away. Instead, I put the phone down, cleaned up the water, and waited. I had to think. I had to plan. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to make the mistake of reacting out of emotion. If she thought she could just betray me and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. But if I wanted to make her truly understand the depth of her betrayal, I couldn't be hasty. I had to make her feel the consequences, but not in a way she would expect. That night when she came home, I acted like nothing had changed. She was as beautiful as ever, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Hey, babe," she greeted me, stepping forward to kiss me on the cheek. I didn't kiss her back. She pulled back slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What's wrong? You okay?" I smiled, or at least I tried to. I wanted to tell her everything, to scream at her, to accuse her of everything. But no, that wouldn't be my way. "I'm fine," I said. "Just a little tired. How was your day?" We spent the evening together like any other evening. She didn't suspect a thing. She didn't know that I had seen the message, that I knew what was really happening. And that was the beauty of it. I was in control and she had no idea. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. I watched her closely, but I didn't let her know. Every time she looked at me, I studied her face, looking for any sign of guilt, any hint that she knew I knew. But there was nothing. She kept pretending like everything was fine. She would smile at me with that same warmth, her eyes lingering on mine as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. I began to play my game. The first step was simple: acting normal. If I acted like everything was fine, if I showed no signs of suspicion, it would put her at ease. She would think that I didn't know. She would think she had gotten away with it. I started to do the things I used to do: cook dinner for her, take her out to our favorite spots, be the attentive husband I had been before. But it was all part of the plan. Every kind gesture, every smile, every word I spoke was calculated. I needed her to believe that I was still the man she had married, the man she thought she could manipulate, the man she thought would forgive her. But I wasn't that man anymore. A week passed. Claire had started to relax around me again, probably thinking that I had let go of whatever had been bothering me. She was trying so hard to act normal, to restore the image of a happy couple. She suggested we take a weekend trip to reconnect. I could tell she was starting to feel the pressure of guilt, but it wasn't enough. I needed her to suffer. I needed her to realize that no amount of fake affection would erase what she had done. I wanted her to sweat, to question every move, every word, every look. But I had to wait. Patience was key. I would make her regret this. I would make her beg for forgiveness, but not because I was merciful. She would beg because she would finally understand that she had lost something far greater than just a husband. I continued without a sound, because silence would be my ally. For the next 2 weeks I lived two lives at once. The public Ethan, the easygoing, forgiving husband who laughed at Claire's jokes and planned small, intimate moments to convince her he still belonged to the same world. And the private Ethan, who moved like a ghost through the edges of her days, cataloging, mapping, and reading a life that had been shared, and then secretly parceled out to someone else. Every action I took had two purposes. One was to reassure her that nothing had changed, to keep her complacent. The other, more important, was to place tiny, almost invisible threads where they could later be pulled. I began with small, deliberate manipulations. A slight delay in returning her messages, nothing suspicious, just enough to suggest the busy life I had always claimed. A playlist I forgot to sync to our dinner stereo, leaving room for a different song to play and remind her of an evening she thought was private. I learned the cadence of her excuses and fed them back to her in half-truths, building an invisible lattice of possibility and doubt. She suggested the weekend away again, this time softer, more insistently. "We should get away," she said in that tired, conciliatory way that used to make me melt. I agreed because that was part of the plan. If I was going to pull the rug out from under her, I also wanted her to be standing on it when it happened. 2 days before the trip, I met Ryan by accident at a coffee shop. It wasn't accidental, of course. I arranged it. He looked like a man who had been carrying secrets in his pockets for far too long. The jut of his jaw, the nervous flick of his fingers, the way he refused to meet my eyes for the first minute. We sat across from each other while the world moved on around us, everything ordinary and absurd. A mother scolding a child, two students laughing over textbooks, the hiss of the espresso machine. Ryan was as much a part of my life as the wallpaper in my childhood home. Now he felt foreign, a stain that could not be scrubbed clean. He tried to smile, to make conversation, to pretend the years of friendship outweighed what he had done. I let him talk. I listened. He offered excuses like currency, blunt, clumsy, useless. I didn't react with anger. I didn't launch into accusations. Instead, I told him about the weekend. I told him casually that Claire and I were leaving for a cabin by the lake, remote, off-grid. He tried to gauge my tone, perhaps to sense whether I would do something irrational. He failed. "You're still going?" he asked, voice small. "Yes," I said, and the simplicity of the word felt like a blade. "We'll be gone for 3 nights. He shifted in his chair. She told me she'd be home alone those nights. You would be welcome to visit," I said, placing the invitation like a seed on the table between us. He swallowed. He didn't go. He left with a hurried goodbye and the kind of furtive, guilty gait that said more than any confession. In the days after, I learned that he'd made plans, tentative and desperate, to see Claire on the nights I would be supposedly away. He didn't know I had rerouted those nights. He didn't know the invitation had been a hook. On the morning we left, Claire kissed me softly at the door, without suspicion, and walked out into the sunlight with a small duffel bag over her shoulder. Her lips brushed mine, and for a second I felt the old ache of love, the memory of all the reasons I had once chosen to tether my life to hers. For a brief heartbeat, I wondered if this would have been the moment to tell her everything, if I could have collapsed into drama and rage and saved myself the long, careful ruin. But that would have been a childish satisfaction. I wanted something else, an education, a dismantling, an exposure so thorough that she could not rebuild the person she'd been. We drove until the city was a smear behind us and the radio was only static and voice. The cabin was exactly as she'd hoped, rustic without being primitive, a little too charming for its own good, surrounded by trees that listened and watched. She unpacked with an ease that had something rehearsed about it, arranging mugs and plates as if practicing domesticity. She hummed under her breath. I watched her set the scene for intimacy and felt a cold satisfaction. The lake outside shimmered like an indifferent witness. At night, as she slept, I walked the perimeter of the property. The dark hugged the trees, the moon a distant coin. I checked the cabin's locks, the house's minor vulnerabilities. I made sure our phones were in airplane mode. The last thing I wanted was a clumsy, physical betrayal to spoil the psychological architecture I was building. This wasn't about exposure for spectacle. It was about trust being ground to dust and then shown to her in the daylight. The first night went according to plan. The second night, at the hour when shadows pool and thoughts wander, a car pulled into the gravel drive. I watched from the window as headlights cut through the trees, and with an odd, distant calm I saw Ryan step out, ducked in a coat, carrying the awkwardness of a man who was about to violate the sanctity of a married retreat. He crept up the porch like a thief, his back rounded, his hands trembling. I could feel the weight of his betrayal as a physical pressure, an almost audible thud against my ribs. I did not meet him at the door. I let him enter. They didn't speak loudly. The soft rasp of their voices slipped like smoke through the cabin. I could hear their laughter then, small and foolish, the same laughter that had once belonged to moments we'd shared. I sat in the dark and listened, cataloging the cadence of their conspiratorial words, the rhythm of their breaths. At some point their embrace tightened, and it was as intimate and obscene as a prayer. I waited until the house was steeped in the shallow hush of two people who think themselves unseen. Then I began. A crash, the subtle, staged kind that shows intent rather than accident, brought them into the living room. A lamp shattered against the floor, glass scattering like frozen rain. Claire jumped up, eyes wide, hair disheveled. Ryan lunged toward her. For a heartbeat, I watched them react not to the noise but to the shape of me stepping out of the darkness. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply stood and watched the realization leak from their faces. The color left Claire's cheeks. Ryan's jaw worked as if swallowing words that threatened to choke him. "You said you'd be alone," Claire whispered. The word was a thin reed of sound. "You said you'd be gone," Ryan replied, breathless, as if the truth could be suffocated by a counterclaim. I let them implode. I wanted to watch the architecture of their deceit crumble from within. I wanted to see how they would stitch themselves together when confronted with the man they had wronged. But what followed wasn't the melodrama I had imagined. Claire's face didn't fill with immediate, repentant shame. Instead, she looked at me with the raw calculation of someone who has been forced to improvise. She reached out, tentative, to touch my arm as if the rightness of physical contact could erase the moral rot that lay beneath. No, the touch recoiled as if a live wire had been touched. I stepped back. The electricity of it was a private thing. I told them to leave the cabin, to walk into the night and out of my life for the time being. I said it in a voice that was steady and small, a voice that made the room feel like a legal chamber rather than a domestic battlefield. They obeyed, each moving with a different type of shame. Ryan's an ugly, animal fear. Claire's a fragile, complicated remorse that looked, to my eyes, like the beginning of grief. They left through the back door and into the woods, swallowed by trees and dew and the sympathetic indifference of the night. When the door closed, I sank onto the couch and felt the enormity of what I had done. I had not struck them down with fury. I had shown them the mirror of their choices and walked away. I wasn't yet finished. This was the shallow end of the lesson. The deeper, long-term work remained. Back in the city, I began to rearrange the world. I didn't want to destroy her life in a way that would feed the tabloids or satisfy some crude hunger for public shamming. My aim was more exquisite, to dismantle the scaffolding of her comfort and security until she could see, in stark, fluorescent light, what she had traded for temporary tenderness. I started with her work. Claire had a reputation. She was competent, admired, pleasant, an asset in a boutique law firm that prized discretion and decorum. I knew where she kept her files, the small things that built her professional identity. I didn't leak anything. I didn't forge documents. Instead, I approached the problem like a slow surgeon. I arranged for small, plausible mistakes to find their way into her professional life. A calendar invite that never arrived, a client correspondence that got buried, an errant page from a presentation left at a coffee shop where someone could photograph it. Each incident on its own would have been shrugged off. People make mistakes. But a pattern stitched together a narrative. Colleagues noticed and murmured. A partner who had been borderline indifferent began to look at her with a new curiosity. An important case was reassigned. These were not catastrophic blows, but they accumulated like drops on a windowpane until the glass fogged. Privately, I sent anonymous notes, no threats, no accusations, just quiet reminders, facts that only someone close to the truth could know. Nothing illegal, nothing that could be pinned on me if she chose to call me out. The notes felt like frost on a window, a slow, inevitable covering that blurred visibility. At home, I continued to play the role of perfect husband. I made breakfasts with an ease that betrayed nothing. I returned her texts in a tone that was warm and patient. When she cried, because eventually she did, quietly in the bathroom as if intimacy had fled her, I handed her a towel and listened in a way that suggested unconditional love. Each act was a calculated mercy. Each moment of comfort deepened the sting when the other wheels of consequence turned. One afternoon she confronted me, not with accusations but with a fragile plea. She asked, not to be forgiven but to be seen honestly. She wanted to understand which thread had led me to this cold forgiveness. I told her, in slow phrases, that trust was a currency and she had spent hours. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in her pain. I made it clear that what she had done would not be smoothed over by sad eyes and small apologies. This only made her try harder, which was precisely what I wanted. She began to offer more than contrition. She offered bargaining. She performed confessions in low voice, offered to do things, to change, to repair. I allowed her to believe that the past could be undone by present devotion. It was crucial that she think there was a path back. And so she stumbled along that path, each step met by a quiet, surgical removal of the comforts she took for granted. Access to our social circle subtly narrowed, invitations lost in the shuffle, a trusted friend who once vouched for her now acting coolly, professionally distant. It was a slow erosion, almost delicate in its cruelty. She felt the ground shift under her feet and tried to step faster, not yet realizing she was breathing thinner air. In the midst of this, Ryan's presence became a variable I could manipulate. He had always been impulsive, a boy who never learned the architecture of consequences. I reached into the one place he was still vulnerable, his own vanity. I gave him opportunities to be seen with Claire in places that mattered. A charity gala where the media liked a scandalous whisper, a business meetup where reputations were currency. I favored the optics that would make other people connect dots and speculate. It was dangerous, perhaps, but Ryan's desire to be seen undid him. He took the bait because he craved the thrill as much as Claire did. And in the friction of their choices, as whispers turned to muttered curiosities in corridors and friends' phones stopped lighting up with happy couple messages, the net tightened. Yet beneath every maneuver there was a shadow of something else, an ache that surprised me. The plan was working beautifully, devastatingly, but it did not bring the cathartic closure I had imagined. I lied to myself that revenge would be a balm. Instead, it felt like an apprenticeship in letting go. Watching Claire scramble, watching Ryan flounder, I began to understand the terrible shape of loss, not only mine but theirs. The cruelty I inflicted was surgical, but there was a human weight to it that pressed down, unrelenting. It was then, in the middle of the slow, precise destruction of everything we once had, that I realized the most painful part of my revenge was not the act of vengeance itself. It was the discovery of how thin and fragile our constructed identities were, how little it took to make them splinter. The knowledge altered me. It did not stop me. It only made the stakes feel more bitterly necessary. The game was far from over. I had taught them the contours of my patience. Next, I would force a public reckoning, but not one that would gratify the screaming part of me. It would be a lesson in perception. What happens when the face you show the world no longer matches the one you keep in private? I wanted Claire to stand in the light and understand that when she had signed onto a life, she had become part of a ledger she could not unilaterally erase. The plan required careful orchestration, timing, and moral restraint. It required me to be more monstrous and more merciful in equal measures. I set the pieces in motion, feeling, for the first time since the discovery, less like a man bent on revenge, and more like an architect who had drawn up a ruin he could not unsee. The night before the reveal, I sat alone on the porch and watched the city breathe in the distance. The lights looked like a constellation of judgments, small and indifferent. I thought of the man I had been and the man I had chosen to become. There was no absolution in what I was about to do, only lesson, an experience delivered with the precision of a scalpel. I closed my eyes and nodded to myself, the faintest of affirmations. Tomorrow, the game would move to its next level, and this time, the consequences would not be limited to private whispers in the dark. They would require stepping into the sun. I spent the next weeks drawing the map of their lives into a blueprint of exposure. Not because I enjoyed cruelty, but because precision required scenery. A stage where reputation mattered, where whispers became roars, where people measured one another by applause and the light that fell on their faces. I chose the annual Legal Society Gala, a luminous, carefully choreographed evening where Claire was due to be recognized for a high-profile pro bono case. The room would be full of partners, rival firms, clients who kept ledgers of loyalty and laterality. If reputation could break, this was the place to test it. Preparation meant infiltration. I reintroduced myself to the machinery of their world: invitations, programs, seating charts. I bought an advertisement in the event program under a name no one would trace to me, an innocuous congratulation that contained, hidden in plain sight, a registration code leading to an online gallery. I paid someone to place a harmless-looking USB drive among the centerpieces, an obsolete gesture, outdated and theatrical, perfect for luring the sort of curiosity that becomes disaster. I made sure the tech team at the venue was distracted that night by a network issue I had quietly scheduled via a third-party contractor. The stage had to belong to my design at the precise moment the lights rose. But the heart of the reveal had to involve them, Claire and Ryan, in a way they could not control. Ryan loved being seen. He craved the adrenaline of being applauded in small circles, being the center of a laugh. I fed him an opportunity. Another friend of ours, someone I had carefully guided toward complicity with small truths and a lot of persuasion, suggested Ryan give a brief toast to Claire as a show of support. Ryan, hungry and careless, accepted. He imagined himself gallant. He did not imagine becoming the vehicle of his own exposure. That evening the ballroom glittered like a promise. Claire moved through it with the composed, merciless grace of someone who had always been practiced at being admired. She shook hands, posed for photographs, allowed the industry's polite smiles to wash across her. I sat at a corner table with an unobstructed view. My presence was a measureless calm. I did not clench my jaw. I didn't glare. I watched as she accepted the whispered congratulation of a partner and moved on, making notes as she did, unaware of the architecture closing around her. Ryan rose to speak. He took the podium with a smile that had always belonged to someone who refused weight. For a moment I felt a primitive urge to stop him, to pull the microphone out and tell the room every private thing I had learned. But theatrics of confession are clumsy. They feed the wrong part of the soul. Instead, I let the plan play like a symphony. Ryan began with flattering anecdotes. then segued into admiration, and finally into a clumsy attempt at intimacy disguised as praise. At precisely the moment he reached for an anecdote that referenced shared special nights, the projector, the one wired to accept the program's USB drives, flickered. Someone on the AV team, urged by a hand in my pocket of outside influence, cued the wrong slideshow. On the screen behind Ryan, instead of the tribute montage of legal wins and charity headshots, a sequence of images scrolled, a preserved thread of messages and photographs that had once been safe on a phone and a laptop. Not pornographic material, not petty, just incontrovertible proof. Screenshots of messages that mapped the arc of the affair, meeting times, coded phrases, a photograph of Claire laughing in a cafe with Ryan while Ethan's name appeared in a separate thread. Gasps spread like a physical force through the room. Glasses went still midair. Conversations fell into the kind of silence that is loud. Ryan's face drained into a colorless ruin. Claire's composure splintered into that brittle, rapid motion of someone trying to hold a mask in place while the glue fails. The program's music stalled, and the MCs looked helpless, eyes flicking toward me like searching for any anchor. She moved first toward the stage, instinct pushing her to salvage dignity. She had always known how to walk into light and make it forgiving. That reflex saved her in lesser crises. This time, though, the light exposed the seams. She reached for Ryan, and for a heartbeat they tried a private choreography, the hands pressed, the small whispers. But the room had already traded privacy for spectacle. Phones lifted, cameras tilted, and the digital age's hunger for scandal began its slow, inexorable feed. Ryan stammered, then lied, poorly, imprecisely, the kind of defense that reveals guilt by trying too hard. Claire's attempts to smile through it turned into thin, perforated gestures. The partners around them turned conversation into calculation. People weigh risk quickly and whisper choices faster. A senior partner who had once praised Claire's professionalism folded into a look of polite reevaluation. Hushed questions moved like currents under still waters. Who had brought this here, and what did it mean for clients who prized discretion? I did not speak. I watched as her colleagues' faces shifted from warmth to assessment. The firm's head approached, ostensibly to escort Claire away. The public face of support was suddenly a private transport to a backroom conversation. A camera panned like a predator, searching for the image that would deliver a headline. My anonymous program ad, the one with the registration code, began to light up in a server I controlled. A curated set of evidence I had placed online started circulating quietly among a small list of firm clients, and a few gossip columns I'd nudged with an anonymous tip. The net worked the way I designed, targeted, precise, not utterly public in the first moments, but poised to grow. She left the stage with a face that had been stripped of everything except a bright, involuntary panic. In the back of the ballroom, she sat with partners, and the conversation veered into legal contingency. A case reassignment was discussed in a tone of clinical removal. Her world, assembled over years by competence and the careful administration of appearances, began to unthread from the very hands that had woven it. I had never hated the industry, only the quiet immunity she assumed it offered her. I had wanted her to understand that where reputation is currency, betrayal is a bank run. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Clients requested transfers. A mentor I had once respected, who owed me small favors for past kindnesses, gave Claire a curt, businesslike letter. Some friends drifted away, not because they believed every exposure, but because proximity to scandal is costly. Ryan found himself the subject of whispered enmity at his firm. His project stalled as partners expressed concern. The headlines were careful at first, factual. Then bolder when an anonymous blog gave the narrative a pulse. I watched the calm dissolution I had orchestrated and felt, weirdly, both triumphant and hollow. Claire did not collapse immediately. Her spine was the same one that had carried her through late nights and hard winds, and for a time she tried to salvage the remaining pieces. She held a private meeting with the firm's partners and offered an account steeped in contrition and bailout measures. Counseling, voluntary leave, restructuring of responsibilities. She performed accountability with a kind of professional choreography she had practiced her whole life. But she could no longer rely on the softer things that had once cushioned mistakes: unquestioned trust, social capital amassed in cocktail hours, the presumption of inviolability. People who had ridden her coattails stepped away. A promising promotion evaporated. Her name in the local networks became a cautionary footnote rather than a headline of promise. I could have stopped then. I could have stepped forward to strip the extravagance from my scheme, to let humiliation be the limit. But the deeper part of the game demanded one more lesson: not ruin for the pleasure of it, but ruin as a mirror. So I offered Claire an out, the kind that looks generous but is a well-planned route to final understanding. I arranged for a mediator to approach her, someone from the firm who had contacts in a nonprofit that managed domestic violence shelters. It was a charitable pivot and a public one. She could take a sabbatical and rebuild in service, redeeming the public image through contrition made active. The choice was a social pressure and a carefully designed cage. I knew what she would prefer before she decided: to stay and fight, or to leave and reflect. Leaving would be perceived as humility. Staying would be an uphill battle that could ruin her further. She chose to leave. The decision felt to me like both victory and surrender. She signed the sabbatical paperwork with fingers that trembled as if with relief. She told me, in a private, unadorned voice, that she would go away for a while to do the work. I watched her make her valise, watch how she folded shirts with the precision of someone who had to keep a composed look even as the ground shifted. She kissed me on the cheek when she said goodbye at the door, a soft contact that asked for something I no longer had the authority to grant. I had won the field. Her public life, the architecture of status and recognition she had built, crumbled enough to force a retreat. People called it consequence, some whispered ruin. To me, it looked more like a lesson carved with too fine a blade. But with victory came an unexpected emptiness. I had spent months designing a world in which her life would rearrange itself around the moral debt she owed. I had watched the world exact its price. I had orchestrated the reveal with surgical care. And yet when the smoke cleared, when the last of the social echoes dimmed, I felt less satiated than I had imagined. The pleasure I expected from seeing her falter was small, mechanical. The deeper sensation was a complicated, bitter grief, not just for the man I had been cheated out of, but for the parts of both of us that had once been capable of trust. The story continued to twist. Claire's absence did not heal me. It complicated the wound. Ryan's guilt mutated into a sort of hollow bravado as he tried to rebuild what was left of himself, only to find that the same hunger that brought them together left him with fewer allies. Friends and colleagues made consumptive judgments, then discarded them as the next scandal arrived. I kept moving forward as if on autopilot. Work, small rituals, the construction of a life that was now deliberately stripped of illusions. There would be more decisions to make. Some were petty, exquisitely personal: the return of a ring, an unrequested conversation with mutual friends, a small reconciliation attempt from Claire at a coffee shop that I declined with civil distance. Others were larger in consequence, legal and practical currents that had to be navigated with care. For now, though, the reveal I engineered had achieved its principal purpose. It had shown her the world she'd taken for granted and forced her into the bright, uncomfortable truth of its fragility. I slept less. I woke with the faint, familiar ache of someone who had used a tool he did not fully know how to wield. The next phase of the game would be quieter and perhaps crueler in its intimacy, to make sure that memory, the kind that lingers in private, would be the heaviest burden she carried. The public fallout had taught her one lesson. The private work I would do next would ensure she could never again move through the world as if her actions had no long shadow. And yet, somewhere deep inside the scaffolding of my plans, I began to wonder about the cost of this architecture. Revenge changes the architect as surely as it breaks the build. I was beginning to see the outlines of what I would become if I kept building. The realization made me slow my hand, not out of mercy for her, but out of fear for myself. The game advanced. The pieces had shifted. The ballroom's lights had long since cooled, and the photograph of Claire's smile in a program lay like a relic on a table. There would be more moves, private and devastating, but for now the reveal had been made. The world had watched. The world had drawn conclusions. The ledger had been written in a careful, unblinking hand. When the ballroom emptied and the echoes of clinking glass faded, life did not snap back into place like a rehearsed act. Instead, it unfolded in a series of small, quiet consequences that had the slow persistence of tidewater. Claire's sabbatical became a public fact, then a rumor, then something people used as shorthand when they described the moment the balance of her life tilted. She retreated into a schedule of volunteer hours and talks at shelters, a public penance laid over private confusion. She kept busy in ways that made her visible enough to seem repentant, but not visible enough to reclaim what had been taken from her. I watched from a distance that I pretended was disengagement, but that was, in truth, another performance. The world had watched her falter. Now I watched how she attempted to live with the knowledge. The first months were an awkward choreography of contrition and effort. She spoke evenly at panels, chose her words with the precision of a person rebuilding a resume and a reputation at once. She wrote op-eds about integrity and the weight of responsibility. She counseled women who had fewer tools than she did, swallowing the irony like a bitter pill. Privately, she wrote to me only once or twice, letters folded with a care that suggested rehearsal rather than catharsis. I read them and set them aside. They did not move me back to mercy. They were curiosities, samples of her attempt at repair. She asked for advice about programs, about which contacts might be useful. She asked if I would forward her a recommendation. Each small petition was a test for me. How much of my life would I let her thread through the needle of my continued existence? I had, in the months since the reveal, learned peculiar things about myself. Revenge consumed a different part of you than grief. It took focus, calculation, a willingness to inhabit the contours of someone else's life and move the furniture without being seen. It also, unexpectedly, taught me how fragile the architecture of empathy could be. The deeper I went, the more solitude seemed like the only honest company, and yet solitude had a price. Then, like a thunderstorm that arrives in the wrong season, news came that fractured the tidy geometry of my plans. Claire called me, voice cautious and strained. She said she needed to speak in person. I could hear that behind the rehearsed cadence there was something unedited, raw. I agreed to meet her at a neutral cafe, neutral so that neither of us could claim territory as leverage. She arrived with an expression that looked like exhaustion wrapped in apology. She placed a small envelope on the table and did not look at me when she spoke. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I'm pregnant." Those two words did not land like a curtain drop. They landed like a stone into deep water, making rings that widened and connected with everything I had built and everything I had broken. For an instant, the world narrowed to a single bright point of ethical complication. The plan I had been drafting in my mind, the slow dismantling, the public lesson, could not simply pivot around the presence of a child. A new ledger had appeared with a column I had not accounted for: responsibility. Claire's eyes searched mine for something like compassion or wrath, maybe for both. She spoke of panic, of a test taken in quiet, of the moment when she realized that consequences were not only public and professional, but biological and intimate. She did not ask for forgiveness in the blunt way she had before. She asked, instead, for consideration, for conversation about what this new life would mean. It was a request that reframed the whole case file we had been living inside. I thought about what revenge would look like now. To continue the campaign in the same manner would mean inflicting consequences on a life not yet formed, making the child an accessory in a dispute they had no hand in creating. It was a line I had not wanted to cross, yet my labyrinth of malice did not recognize absolutes until faced with an image of a future that involved someone unable to choose. At the same time, The reveal of pregnancy brought with it a new, sharper question about Ryan. If he had been reckless enough to trade our years for a sequence of secret nights, would he step up? Or would he retreat into the cowardice he had shown when faced with consequences? I decided this would be the real crucible for both of them. Not my public exposure, but the private, character-defining response to the responsibility they had created. I set a trap, not a vindictive, media-fed spectacle this time, but a test of integrity. I told Ryan, via a mutual acquaintance, that there were details to discuss about the future, that it would be responsible and right for him to face what was coming. Then I watched. When he learned of the pregnancy, his first response was a rush of self-preserving flattery. How it could be an adventure, how they could find a way. But the man who had hidden behind charm and adrenaline was not built for the patient, messy work of accountability. As days turned into weeks, his promises became long, elaborate excuses. Interviews for new positions, quick trips, an emergent busyness that shepherded him away from the hard act of fatherhood. I stopped orchestrating the public unraveling and focused instead on relationships. I arranged, subtly, for Ryan to be confronted by people who mattered to him, the friend who had once admired him, the colleague who had lent him opportunities, so that his excuses could not live in a vacuum. They pressed him for clarity and commitment, until he could no longer maintain the myth that he was the gallant rogue. His choices had consequences manifested in firm memos and the quiet distancing of professional allies. The result was not a cinematic fall but a slow, degradational retreat. Ryan's vibrancy dulled. Firms that had flirted with his charisma began to hesitate. His projects stalled because, in the world of business, reliability is a currency, and he had spent it on thrills. That collapse had no single dramatic moment. It was a cumulative accounting of the man he chose to be. Claire, meanwhile, had to decide what kind of mother she wanted to be, what kind of example she wanted to present to the child she carried. The shelter work she had taken on was not theater for her. It was a real encounter with people who had survived worse than infidelity. She learned humility in harder, truer ways than I had planned. She wrote to me sometimes, shorter now, about ultrasounds and doctors and plans she was making. The tone carried both fear and a strange, tender hope. It was not the kind of thing vendettas are built to dismantle. I found myself at a crossroads that forced a deeper interrogation. What was the purpose of this exacting, surgical revenge if it left an innocent to pay? The revenge I had built was meant to be an education, painful, instructive, so that the person who had broken trust would understand the magnitude of loss. But the child was neither the betrayer nor the betrayed. The child was a new ledger entry binding both of them to a future I had never intended to govern. So I altered the plan. I stopped feeding the public story and withdrew from the social theater I had constructed. I let the press narrative cool. I let the firm do what it did in its own quiet way. I redirected my energy toward controlling what I could ethically control, the boundaries around my life and the truth. Instead of continuing to punish for punishment's sake, I used my leverage to force accountability where it mattered. I insisted on conversations, long, fact-driven, practical conversations, about legal responsibilities, paternal rights, and support. I made it clear to Ryan that if he wanted the pleasures of fatherhood, he needed to assume its burdens as well: financial support, presence, and a public acceptance of responsibility. I did not relish the role of arbiter, but someone had to impose structure where chaos had reigned. That pressure produced something I had not expected: a brittle sincerity from Ryan. He stumbled through promises and made mistakes, but he also, for the first time, began the tedious labor of being dependable. It did not absolve him of what he had done, but it made him tangible when he had been a shadow. Claire responded cautiously. She wanted safety for her child more than moral vengeance, so she negotiated terms that emphasized stability and clarity. The surprising truth was that, in the face of an imminent life, their selfishness had to mutate into something lesser, or at least more practical than before. They calibrated. They adjusted. The arithmetic of responsibility is less dramatic than riveted fury, yet somehow more effective. It delivered a kind of justice that did not feed my hunger for spectacle, but gave shape to a future that would not be designed solely by my desire to wound. And me, I found that my rage, sated in part by public consequence, required different nourishment now. I could have smashed the remainder of their lives for art's sake, but that would have turned me into a monster indefinite in appetite. Instead, I let the architecture of my revenge erode into something leaner, an insistence on truth, on accountability, on the removal of illusions. The moral calculus shifted from punitive to protective. Protect the child from being collateral damage. Protect myself from becoming someone I would not recognize in the mirror. The consequence was quieter than vengeance, but no less severe. Claire's career never fully recovered its trajectory. Ryan's social currency dwindled to a bland residue. They were changed. They had to live with the facts they had created. I too was changed, seasoned by the strange empathy of having to weigh suffering against fairness, revenge against reason. There are still nights when I walk past the places that used to hold us the way they were, restaurants where laughter felt permanent, the couch where quiet conversations once bloomed, and I feel that old ache, a residual of what I had loved and lost. But the plan I had so methodically assembled had taught me, above all, that people's lives are complicated, interwoven in ways that simple retribution rarely resolves. So the game shifted from spectacle to stewardship. I let them live under the consequences of their choices, but I refused the satisfaction of destroying what could yet be protected. The next moves would not be public reveals or scandal, but the less glamorous, more intimate work of choosing what to remember, what to discard, and how to rebuild a life after betrayal, whether that rebuilding meant togetherness, separation, or something in between. The months after the pregnancy announcement folded into each other like pages turned too quickly. The public spectacle cooled into private logistics. The moral theater I had staged receded, and a different kind of work took its place. The slow, bureaucratic, human work of arranging lives that had been broken and insisting that responsibility be paid in ways that could not be ignored. I had thought I wanted fireworks, a ruin bright enough to scorch memory. Instead, I found myself policing small truths, signing forms, negotiating custody language I never imagined I would care about, demanding that promises be kept in measurable installments rather than in the vapor of flattery. Claire learned how to be pragmatic. She learned the vocabularies of apologies that translate into action, scheduled visits with therapists, transparency in appointments, the reluctant admission that she had traded security for a moment of forbidden warmth. Ryan, who had once ridden his charm through rooms like a lucky coin, discovered how quickly people tire of paying for unreliability. He stepped up in fits and starts, more from obligation than ardor, and the child he had created defined him in ways his frothier impulses never could. I had at first imagined that my final lesson would be a devastating liberation, some public reveal so complete that there would be nothing left of their vanity. But I had changed during the course of the work. Revenge had taught me to be surgical and patient. Something in me had also learned to measure cruelty against consequence. I realized that crushing them entirely would also crush the thing that was not theirs to pay for, the child. The ledger had shifted. Innocence had entered the equation. So my final move was not a flamboyant act of destruction. It was quiet and oddly humane. I called Claire to meet once more, not at some dramatic site, but at a small civic office where paperwork was processed, where a neutral woman took notes and stamped decisions with even hands. There we negotiated an agreement that had teeth, a custody schedule that guaranteed security for the child, and a financial plan that made responsibility predictable rather than theatrical. I insisted on transparency about health care, schooling funds, and contact lists. I demanded that no further efforts at subtle manipulation, no staged appearances designed to rekindle public sentiment or to garner private sympathy, be used as bargaining chips. When she listened, Finally, clearly, I felt less like an executioner and more like a man closing a contract he had helped write. There was no dramatic speech, no final slamming of doors. Instead, there was the authorized rustle of paperwork, the scratch of pen on legal pads, the sterile sound of decisions being made. In that small, bureaucratic theater, the last big act of my revenge found its shape, not obliteration but structural reparation. After the paper was signed, Claire reached for something that had the stubborn gesture of old affection. She offered an apology that was not rehearsed performance but a simple, raw recognition, the kind that does not demand immediate absolution. I accepted it only insofar as acceptance meant no further exploitation of her weaknesses. Forgiveness was not a currency I spent lightly. It was a door I could open if and when I chose. For now, the door remained ajar and practical. Life after that settled into new rhythms. I returned to the city and to the architecture I had always loved, but the drafts I drew had different margins. My attention turned inward in ways it hadn't before. I took long walks at dawn, not to plot but to think. I rebuilt rituals that did not require validation from others. I let old photographs remain as artifacts rather than prescriptions for how I should feel. The edges of bitterness dulled, not because I had forgiven, but because I had redirected the energy elsewhere, into small acts of repair for myself. Sometimes I saw Claire in the margins of life. Once, months later, she stood at the edge of a schoolyard holding a small coat, watching a child who was not yet mine, eyes soft with an ache that was not wholly self-pity. I felt a stab of something I could not classify, neither triumph nor mercy, but the complicated human recognition that we had both altered each other's lives irrevocably. Ryan appeared in less visible spaces, face lined in the way of a man whose currency had been spent and not replaced. He learned, slowly and reluctantly, the dignity in showing up. There were days I imagined grander endings, dramatic confrontations, public confessions, a violent exposure that would leave no room for rumor. Those imaginings dwindled like fireworks, bright for an instant, then gone. The truth I had been trying to etch into their lives had already been written, not in headlines but in the mundane ledger of missed promotions, in a child's stroller, in the redistribution of mutual friends. Consequence had a way of being slow and precise. It didn't always satisfy the raw need for spectacle, but it taught more durable lessons. In the end, the most radical act of vengeance I performed was an inner one, a refusal to become a man defined by retaliation. I would not allow the architecture of my life to be permanently designed around their mistakes. I reclaimed the parts of myself that had been given away in the confusion of grief: curiosity, the capacity to love again in ways unlinked to possession, an appetite for craft rather than for cunning. I re-entered my daily life with a new insistence on boundaries, on choosing what I carried forward and what I laid down. There was, too, a quiet inheritance of the experience, an unshakable realism about how quickly fidelity can be negotiated away and how resilient human beings are at rebuilding. That realism made me less naive but not colder. It taught me to protect the sanctuary of my inner life more carefully, and to value transparency in a way that would steer me clear of future traps. Months turned into a slow, merciful calendar. The child arrived into the world with a weightless gasp, and I watched from a distance that no longer hurt like it once had. The presence of that small, helpless being reframed everything into human scale. What matters are the small things: being present for a scraped knee, the ritual of bedtime that makes the night less lonely, the measured steadiness of someone who chooses reliability over flux. If there is an image that sums up the end of it all, it is not the ballroom lights or the shattered program, but a bench in a quiet park where seasons turned and people walked by with lives that were messy and ordinary. I sat there one late afternoon, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee cooling in the autumn air, and for the first time in a long time felt a softness that wasn't self-pity or victory but just a plain human peace. It was small and brittle, yes, easily splintered, but it was mine. I did not get the clean catharsis I had once fantasized about. The revenge I enacted taught me too many hard lessons about the cost of cruelty, about the ways our lives are braided together beyond our sins. Yet I also learned that when betrayal cuts you open, you can either let anger hollow you out or you can use the wound as a seam to stitch yourself back together with a different thread. So I rewired my life. I kept the memory of what happened as one keeps a scar, not to display but to remember the boundary it marks. I let the past inform my present without allowing it to dictate my choices. I made myself accountable to a code I had articulated in the quiet months after the reveal. Do not make others pay for the sins they committed against you by creating collateral damage. Demand responsibility, protect innocence, and above all, learn to live again. There is no cinematic final scene in which I walk away whistling into the sunset. There is no satisfying permanent erasure of what was done. But there is a conclusion, small and human, the slow reclaiming of life, the decision to build a future that is not scaffolding for revenge, and the choice to measure justice in real, enforceable terms rather than in the electric thrill of devastation. That, I decided, was the most honest end I could give us all.